Chapter 16. Adeena opened her eyes slowly. Her head was jackhammering, pounding pain, worse than any other time she had played the Duncan. It was so bad she wasn't quite sure she could even stand up. She had fallen to the floor and lay on her back, frozen on the wool carpet in the great room of the cottage, with her cello lying beside her. Her face was turned toward the fireplace, where the roaring fire she built was reduced to a single incinerated log over a glowing heap of embers. She stared into the glow from the fireplace, closed her eyes, and thought of Catherine. Are we the same person? Only her grandmother would have believed any of this, that a person could be caught between two places in two different times, unsure of who they really were. Adeena tried to turn her head. The movement made the pain in her skull worse, but she managed to turn slightly toward the wall of windows. She saw the moonlight reflected on strands of wispy clouds, and could just make out stars in the night sky, though the amber moonlight washed most of them away. Her mind was spinning. Do time and space matter? Is there something that transcends them and guides a soul between two incarnations, regardless of where and when they exist? Adeena sighed with a sense of frustration, a feeling of anger. It's just a dream, a very real dream that I'm making up inside my own fucked up head. The fire began to crackle, and a tiny flame erupted as the center of the remaining log finally succumbed. She felt tears streaming down her cheeks. She let them fall to her lips, the salty sting adding to her despair. She sobbed, trying to release all the frustration and anger inside her. After a while, the tears stopped. Adeena remained on the floor, breathing deeply, her eyes closed. She was not of this world, but she was not of any other world either. Is this what happened to my grandmother, Margaret Rose? Everyone said she was disturbed. Is that my fate? Am I to become like her? She lay on the floor thinking for a few minutes, and then gradually, ever so slowly, she began to feel a calmness settling over her. Strength from somewhere deep within began to take hold. She pushed herself back up into a sitting position, and then, with an even greater effort and a loud groan, she heaved herself onto her feet. Her wobbly legs wavered for a moment before she could find her balance. There was a determination growing within her. She would never give up. She would not surrender to pity. She wasn't going to blame someone else for her problems. For too long her self-doubt had been a vice grip of despair, an unrelenting demon of negativity. Adeena reached for the Duncan cello and prepared to play the score once more. She remembered something Margaret Rose had once told her. Fear is for those who are afraid to live. And Adeena suddenly felt she wasn't afraid of anything. The music poured once again from the Duncan cello, a hypnotic elixir intoxicating the ladies and gentlemen assembled around Adeena. The other musicians followed her lead, adding harmonic counterpoints. The violins and violas picked up her cello lines in tidal waves of musical power. Adeena looked across the gathered men, dressed in tartan colors, many in elaborate Highland garb. The ladies, in white silk gowns with fine embroidery, seemed to be as completely absorbed with her music as the men. Most wore white roses or white ribbons. She knew she was playing for what must be the grand ball at Drummond Castle. This room was twice the size of the one she had performed in at Kinnaird. A row of pewter torches and suspended wheels of hanging chandeliers with hundreds of burning candles on each one gave the hall a glowing radiance full of fire and life. Adeena stood up, setting the cello aside. She closed her eyes and began to sing words that had come to her as a bewildered teenager, but that now had found their purpose. Her voice resonated throughout the room, finding every ear that longed to be found. Gone is my heart without you. Now I am lost once again, praying for life that grows within. All I can ask is when. When will the sword meet the sky to show where I belong? Forever I will wait for you, even after I'm gone. Now as you raise the flame of hope, sailing into the darkest sea, the black night is all around. You light the way for me. When will you turn night to day, so hope may greet the dawn. Forever I will wait for you, even after I'm gone." As the music rose behind her, she swelled with a kind of confidence she had never experienced. Adeena opened her eyes. James Drummond, standing near the front of the room, draped in a dark flowing plaid and a starched white tunic, stared sternly into her eyes. Unblinking, unmoving, she felt the power of his gaze looking directly inside of her. He didn't seem to just listen to her music and to her aching words. It was more like he absorbed them in every cell of his rugged frame and trembled in response. When the song was over, there was a brief moment of silence. Only a crackling from 2 blazing fires at both ends of the room could be heard. Then the men and women erupted into cheering and applause with an outburst of chanting and shouting that threatened to wake both the living and the dead from across the whole of Perthshire. A tall, nobly dressed young man with fine, delicate features moved forward, and the crowd acknowledged him with more chanting. He made a dashing image in his Highland coat of silk tartan, red velvet breeches, and a blue bonnet trimmed in gold, topped with a large jewel and St. Andrew's cross. He wore a green sash, and carried himself with a regal, yet energetic step toward Adeena. She was unsure of the protocol here. She knew that very likely this was the prince, Bonnie Prince Charlie as history knew him, but much more of a natural leader than she had expected. The stilted paintings of him always made him look like a royal fashion model, rather than a soldier prince leading his army into battle. The sight of him moved Adeena. She bowed her head and attempted an awkward curtsy, then dropped to her knee. "Lady Catherine," he said to her in a commanding voice, "you honour my father, King James, and the kingdom of his ancestors. All of Scotland is inspired by your music. Rise." He offered his hand to her, and she held it out for a second. Their eyes met, and he smiled, displaying a countenance as royal as anyone she had ever imagined could be. Adeena stood, and Prince Charles bowed his head to her. The assembly roared their approval as she stood smiling before them, waves of cheering filling her with the satisfaction that had come from releasing the music within her to people who wanted it, as surely as they needed air to fill their lungs. "Lady Catherine!" the crowd chanted. She bowed and felt her face flush again. The prince stood beside her, and when she raised her head, he turned to her and whispered, "You have captured their hearts. Hold them carefully." He paused a moment to acknowledge the chanting, and then left her, walking to the side of the room to speak to 2 men who seemed the only ones in the room who remained serious and stern. The chanting continued, and then James, who had been standing at the very front of the room, stepped forward almost touching her. "Catherine, you honour us," he said, talking just loud enough over the chanting so that only she could hear him. "Your gift is rare and precious, and—" he seemed to be at a loss for words, almost nervous. "I am glad you are here tonight, with me." She nodded in acknowledgement. She noticed that George had been near the front of the room, sitting next to a middle-aged woman about the same age as Adeena's mother. She recognized her instantly, James's mother, Lady Jeanne. Her white rose was prominently displayed on her dark shawl. "Lady Catherine, you are as brave as you are musical," she said in a steady, powerful voice. "James told me you saved one of his young soldiers." "I only wrapped his wound," Adeena replied. "Is he okay?" Then, seeing Lady Jeanne's quizzical expression, added, "I mean, is he well?" "Aye, the surgeon says he will fight again for the prince," Lady Jeanne said. "Your bravery saved him, but I think it is your music that might win the battle." She looked over at George. "Your sister has a rare gift, a voice that inspires men." She turned her gaze to Adeena. "And ladies, too." George nodded. "Her song has always been strong, and her heart true. It's helped me become decided on what I must do." James, who had been listening intently, turned to George. "You will join us, then?" "I will," George replied. "I must fight for my country, and for my family. The Carnegies and the Drummonds helped build this kingdom. I cannot turn my back on those who died for me." "You honour them well, George," Lady Jeanne said. "Your uncle and my dear husband prayed they would have sons like you, and like my James." "Thank you, Lady Jeanne," George said. "If only all our family knew their duty." "Your brother has chosen another path," Lady Jeanne said. "He was fed lies all his life in Glasgow, and turned away from his aunt Lady Margaret of Kinnaird in Carnegie history. I remember how much she tried to help him after her husband, the Earl, died. He refused to accept her guidance." James looked at George. "Fighting your own brother will not be easy, but the blood of our fathers shed must not have been spilled in vain." George nodded. Lady Jeanne touched her son's shoulder. "James, you must give thanks to Lady Catherine." James smiled and looked at Adeena. He raised a hand to quiet the boisterous men and even more boisterous women who had continued their chanting and clapping all this time. He raised his voice, booming over them. "This is why we fight!" he yelled out, extending his arm towards Adeena. "This is who we are, a nation, the Scots. We are not English. The Union is dead." The crowd roared its approval. The prince, talking to two tall officers at the side of the room, looked up. James continued forcefully. "We are each of us the descendants of our fathers and our grandfathers, men who lived and died to preserve this land. And we are one with every father and every grandfather who followed their king for more than 400 years to build a nation and our own parliament." The crowd cheered after every tiny pause, each single inflection in his speech. He quieted them now by raising his arm. "And now Charles Edward, our bonny prince, has proclaimed his father, James the Eighth, as our true and rightful king, the King of Scotland." Adeena stood watching James, transformed from nervous suitor to fierce orator. "Our bonny prince has already led us to victory in the Highlands. We have routed the English dogs and their general cope everywhere they have tried to halt us," James shouted. "They have failed, and they will fail again, and again, and every time they dare to try to stop us." James looked at Adeena. His eyes were wild with passion. The prince, who had been huddled with the two officers, moved towards James and Adeena. He looked out at the crowd, and the room quickly grew quiet as he raised his arm. "This man," he said, gesturing towards James, "has been a part of my most trusted council ever since I made landfall in the kingdom, some 8 weeks hence. He helped lead us with his courage, his bravery, indeed, his determination. The Duke of Perth is a man that Perthshire, and indeed all of Scotland, should hold in their hearts with pride." The men and women showed their approval with applause and a toast to the Duke. "And tonight, fair ladies and brave gentlemen, I appoint James Drummond, Duke of Perth, to the rank of Lieutenant General in the army of King James the Eighth. He is a leader that I will entrust with my own life." Adeena looked up at James. He bowed his head to the prince and then turned toward her. Their eyes locked for a moment, and then James turned away. The crowd was still cheering at the announcement until the prince raised his hand once more. "Tomorrow," he thundered, "the 11th day of September in the year of our Lord 1745, we march toward Edinburgh, and before the week is over, the city will be restored to its rightful place as capital of the Kingdom of Scotland." The crowd exploded, and the other musicians, sensing the joyous mood, began a spirited jig. The prince laughed out loud as the music began. He presented himself to one of the prettiest young ladies in the room with an exaggerated, playful bow. They began to dance, with the adoring approval and conspicuous envy of the other ladies in the room. James turned and bowed to Adeena and offered her his hand. She accepted it, and they joined the others on the wooden floor laid with wide beams of polished oak. She instinctively knew the dance the moment they began. Her feet and legs moved in graceful sync with James and the other couples in the room. James took his dancing seriously. He never missed a step, never took a break, and only stopped when the musicians themselves paused momentarily. Adeena was caught up in the excitement. She twirled, curtsied, laughed, and felt like she was flying in the air most of the time, her feet barely touching the ground. The DJ at the Mercury Lounge was no match to the motivating power of the violin and viola, encouraged by a room lubricated with an unending supply of ale and brandy. Adeena's only thought was to keep pace with James. They danced until she thought she couldn't possibly take another step, and then they danced some more. When the music finally did end, Adeena wasn't sure she could still walk. She was physically exhausted, but felt only joy. Any worries she might have had were vanquished. She had given the musical performance of her life, playing her own composition, which connected deeply and directly with her audience. And then she had got lost in dancing to music that felt as natural as if it had sprouted from the ground itself. James took her hand and led her outside into the cool night air. She followed without questioning where they were going. "Milady, you dance as one who's free, unfettered by what others think," he said as they stepped through the archway that led to a generous stone balcony. The evening air felt crisp. A nearly full moon in the cloudless sky provided a glowing iridescence to the surroundings. "I've never danced like that before," Adeena replied. "Ever." They reached the edge of the balcony, a wall of stone about chest high. She looked out at the neatly manicured gardens before her, resplendent with tall flowers, carved hedges, neatly trimmed shrubbery, and ornamental trees. Even by moonlight it was impressive. James stood near her and looked out at the gardens before them, and then turned his gaze toward her. Even without looking, she could feel his eyes. She turned her head to face him. "Catherine, I feel so young with you, never sure of myself," he said haltingly. "I have laid out the entire town of Kiev. I have led men into battle. I've even managed to win the approval of my mother, Lady Jeanne. But with you—" Adeena waited for him to continue. He was over 6 feet tall, but seemed as shy as a little boy. "With me, what?" "With you, I feel like I know absolutely nothing," he replied. "How shallow I must seem, to you with your power to make the fiercest of men shed tears, and every woman feel one with your soul." Adeena could hardly breathe listening to his analysis. She stared at James, unable to respond. The wind rustled across the trees in the distance. The conversation from the hall flooded towards them, white noise ebbing and flowing in the background. "You are anything but shallow," she said, and then looked away at the neatly laid out gardens. "I really don't understand myself, the power this music seems to have." "It's part of you," he whispered, "perhaps not meant to be understood." The glow of the moon outlined his face before her. His features were soft, and his eyes had an intensity that held her transfixed, unable to turn her eyes from his. The breeze suddenly picked up and rustled in the trees. She shivered from the frigid air, holding her arms to her chest. James had grabbed his plaid cape on the way out of the hall and thrown it over himself. He unwrapped most of it now, extending it towards her. "Come closer," he offered. She took a step forward. He took most of his cape, still wrapped around his neck, and placed it around her, drawing her in. He placed his arms over her shoulders and pulled her closer. Adeena felt warm inside his cape, and as natural as if she had done this with him 1,000 times. She placed her arms around him, his back taut and muscular. She closed her eyes and laid her face on his shoulder. They spoke not a word. The breeze made its own harmonies, sweeping through the distant trees. The music from the ball began again. James and Adeena unconsciously started to sway, moving together slowly, wrapped in each other's arms. Adeena felt like she was melting, becoming a part of him. They moved together naturally, drifting slowly across the balcony, floating in tiny circles. There was no need for conversation. After a few minutes, she raised her head from his shoulder, and he looked down upon her. There was fire in his eyes. He lowered his face to hers. She parted her lips, and he kissed her softly, tentatively, sweetly. She opened her mouth to his. Adeena's head was spinning, and her whole body wanted him. They responded to each other like lovers separated for centuries. Lights began to explode in her head, and then the darkness consumed her once more.